I'm afraid of heights. And that was one of the drivers behind me wanting to get my pilot's license. I'm a big thrill seeker, and I've been finding my ways into more of the, maybe not extreme sports, but downhill skiing, snowboarding, kiteboarding, anything where you can get a little bit of that thrill. And I found that as I get a little bit higher up, you get a little bit more of that adrenaline rush. I don't like standing on my balcony, but something about being in the air is just so peaceful and relaxing. And it's such a great opportunity to, weirdly enough, reflect on everything around you when there's only the skies and the floors, as they say.
Welcome. This is Uncommon Sense, a CPA podcast presented by the Heshe CPA Knowledge Center. The Center is an initiative of the CPA Education Foundation, the charitable arm of the Chartered Professional Accountant profession in Alberta. For the record, this CPA podcast isn't about bean counting. Our episodes feature conversations with Alberta CPAs sharing their insights on a wide range of timely topics. Hello, I'm Gordon Turtle, and on this episode of Uncommon Sense, we're plunging into the world of artificial intelligence, or AI. AI is something that everyone is talking about these days, sometimes with excitement and sometimes with a bit of trepidation. To help understand what AI is and its place in our world today, we have a guest who is a true expert in the field. Chartered Professional Accountant Stan Korsountsev is a senior manager in Deloitte's AI and data practice and has years of experience using and teaching others about artificial intelligence. Stan has nearly a decade of experience in turning emerging technologies into transformative business outcomes. He has led the development of cutting-edge AI proofs of concept, harnessed robotic process automation at scale, and shaped data governance strategies across industries. Formerly serving as Chief of Staff for a 600-plus member AI team, Stan executed high-impact initiatives, from generating dynamic dashboards for thousands of employees to guiding forward-looking fiscal strategies. Stan's insights offer a compelling look into where AI came from, how it works, and the opportunities it presents for those poised to lead in a rapidly evolving market. In other words, Stan is the perfect person to introduce us to this timely and fascinating subject. Welcome, Stan.
Thank you for having me today, Gordon. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming in. So to begin, Stan, can you talk a bit about how you as a CPA became interested in AI and decided to build your career in this field?
It's definitely a little bit of a unique trajectory, but it starts out quite typical. So I went to MacEwan University back in the day, favorite school, and I went through the commerce program. As I was going through that, obviously went through the recruiting process, and that's when I found out about Deloitte and all the amazing things that you get through the accounting career. So somehow along the way, I got sold into the dream of accounting, and I found myself working in Calgary as part of our internal audit team. And over the years, as I got deeper into the program, I got my actual CPA letters, I noticed that there's a lot of repetitive tasks, and you're spending a lot of time not doing what you would maybe consider the value add. You're doing a lot of searching for information. Whereas as an accountant, you really want to be doing the critical thinking. That's where you're adding value to an organization. And I found that if you're spending a lot of time trying to find the documents and then you're only spending 20% of your time doing the thinking, well, is there another way? And that's where I started finding my way into just faster ways of doing my work. And I know automation is a broad term, but it might be either using Excel macros to speed things up. As you mentioned, there's robotic process automation, RPA. So that technology has been around for about 20 years. And I just started dabbling with these little functionalities or softwares or whatever I had available to me at Deloitte. And that was my initial click. And that was the moment to say, okay, there's something really cool here. And I've been a nerd my whole life. I've been telling everybody for a week now that I bought myself a new desk.
Wow, congratulations.
Yes, right. Like that's the most, I would say, excited response that I've got. And I feel like you're a little bit on the hook to be excited on my behalf. But that's the kind of thing that gets me out of bed in the morning is how do I either be more efficient with my approach to something, or how do I teach somebody else to save time in their day? And all of that is where really that whole AI journey began, because automation is just a natural step in that journey.
So when you say you began dabbling and looking around, trying to find easier way to do things, was that just something you were doing on your own, or did Deloitte say, "Can you look into this, Stan?"
I think there's a natural entrepreneur spirit within all of the consulting world because you don't have someone sitting over your shoulder. We're not time-based employees, we're outcome-based employees. So there's a natural drive behind everybody to say, okay, well, Stan, if you can get your job done in 4 hours, that's great. I don't have to sit inside the office for 8, even though I have 8 hours worth of work. So how can I get my job done in 4 so then I can use my other 4 hours to either explore something, maybe learn a new subject, go talk to clients, and build out a team? So I think that natural element of just consulting lifestyle, the type A personalities, you're just trying to grow and evolve and educate yourself and the folks around you, really creates an amazing environment for that learning.
That's awesome. So what is your current role at Deloitte, and what is the role of the firm's AI and data practice team?
That's a great question, Gordon. And maybe a bit of the ambiguous version is I'm a senior manager at Deloitte within our AI and data practice. And as I say that, my parents, they typically look at me smiling and their eyes glaze over, and then we continue conversation about something else. But at the end of the day, what Deloitte is known for, and all Big Four or consulting companies, is we help our clients solve complex problems. Realistically, you can come to us with any issue you have as a company or an organization, and we'll likely either have done it, or we know how to solve it, or we have our broad network around the world that can help us out. In my world specifically, I deal with the AI and data components. So right now, given the interest and the focus of generative AI, I spend a lot of my time either in education or helping folks understand where are some of those opportunities, and really, how do you make this whole AI concept more tangible? We hear a lot about it on LinkedIn. We are hearing about it on all sorts of social media, that it's coming, it's taking over the world, that ChatGPT is everywhere. And there's a lot of this angst. And I find that a lot of what we do is to say, hey, we're still here. The world hasn't changed. We're all going to get through this. It's just the next piece of technology. And there's natural ways that they might fit into your organization, or maybe it's not. And this is really that whole journey that we're helping our clients with.
Okay, so I want to come back to that angsty part later on, but I guess to start off our more detailed discussion, you mentioned the term generative AI. Can you tell me and our listeners, who perhaps know as little about this as I do, can you tell us what that means, generative AI, and how it works?
For sure. And I love this question because I find that every person has their own definition, right? Like, we all know roughly how it technologically works, but because I'm not a coder myself, I like to go back to the layman's definitions. And taking a very, very far step back, what is artificial intelligence? What are we dealing with here? At the end of the day, it's a math calculation. 2 + 4 equals, and then it predicts something, in this case, 6. As you make those math calculations more complex, you eventually get to something that we call artificial intelligence. And it's able to take a certain level of inputs and then have a certain output. So back in the 60s, and I'm taking us a little bit back to my favorite times. Back in the 60s, of course, we had our first iteration of artificial intelligence. And what we were able to predict back then is chess moves. You probably heard either Kaspersky or one of those other old systems. They were able to beat humans in chess. And that was a massive evolution in the technology.
And that was artificial intelligence?
That was the start of artificial intelligence, yeah. It was a bit more programmatic in terms of, because in chess, realistically, there's a limited number of moves. Sure, there's hundreds of thousands or millions or billions, I don't remember, depending on which scenario you get to, but there's still a finite number, as opposed to the way that you can move yourself through space and time. So as that technology got more advanced, I think around the 80s, we got into something called machine learning. So now we can put in more data, we have more inputs, and then we can have more nuanced outputs. And at this point, we can start to predict the weather. So we can tell that tomorrow, based on the crazy weather that we saw today, tomorrow's probably not going to be plus 45. But now with AI, we can get a little bit more granular on is it going to be plus 5? Is it going to be minus 2? What does it look like? And then as that technology evolved, we got into the early 2000s, and we got something called deep learning. And we were talking about neural nets and trying to replicate the human brain using technology. And this is where we started getting into this deep learning. And now we have self-driving cars. We have a whole bunch of inputs. There's sensor data. We understand what the world around us is starting to look like, and we can start to make decisions in real time. And this is, again, all of this is artificial intelligence, and it's still taking more and more information. But at the end of the day, it's just predicting something. Predicting, should you drive past the stop sign or not? Probably not. Now we get into around the 2010s, and that's actually roughly when generative AI first came about. It wasn't good enough to be mass produced or available to the mass markets, but the ability is the same. You put in something and you get a certain output. You're able to predict a certain output. Now, how does generative AI work? And how does this whole training thing work? And my favorite example is, Gordon, do you remember fill in the blank tests?
I do.
And you've probably either, biology, pick your subject, you go through and you cover one word and you say, okay, mitochondria. And you're trying to remember what that is. Or maybe on the other side, you read a definition, the powerhouse, or this is the powerhouse of the cell. And you're like, I think that's mitochondria. You check, okay, good. And maybe the first couple times you got it wrong, but you're an eager beaver and you tried a few more times and then eventually you got the right answer. So generative AI effectively learns that exact way. You give it a sentence, you fill one word, and you say, predict what that word is. And if you do that enough times, now, I'm not sure, how many times would you have done a fill-in-the-blank test to prep for an exam?
Oh, I don't know. Several, I guess.
Right, like maybe let's say 10,
Yeah.
Right? So this is doing it at about 1 billion times. Billions of times. So if you do something to that level, you're going to get pretty good at predicting what is a logical next thing. And the crazy part is, here, it takes any sentence or it takes any information you're able to provide it. That might be an image, or it might be a video, or it might be a start of a song. And this generative AI is able to say, okay, well, based on what I'm seeing, this is what would be a next logical thing to show in the pattern. And hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of how it works. And it's really taking that understanding of cover off one thing, predict what that is, and then expand until you get to this ability to answer Fermi questions. There's a whole bunch of byproducts that were unexpected that are moving us closer to this artificial general intelligence, or this concept of an almighty AI.
So, in other words, the more data you put in, the more it learns, and then it can generate better and more frequent predictions.
Yes, I would say typically the more information or the more data that system has, the better it is. But I think there's an important distinction that I like to call out for folks between the librarian and the PhD. So if I ask you two questions, one is you have 10 Shakespeare books. And I say, Gordon, I need you to either memorize every single word and every single book. And that's going to make you a PhD in Shakespeare. Or I could ask you to just memorize the book's title, and you'll probably roughly know what they're about. Like, read them once, but I don't need you to cite them. Just know where these books are. And I'm assuming you can probably tell me which one's going to be more difficult.
That first one, I would guess.
Yeah, it's going to take a little bit more time to memorize. He's got a couple of pieces of work from what I hear. So, and when you think about the effort from a human perspective, that's the same as an AI. When you're trying to educate, that's the hard part, right? It's hard to learn to ride a bike. It's not hard to ride the bike, right? So that's an important component here, is when you're trying to teach something, education's difficult. And in the same way, it's difficult for AI. We can pay for it, but it's expensive. Now, the second question that I might ask you is, in the PhD version or the librarian version, quote me the 5th paragraph from Hamlet. So now you think about that. As a PhD, you're relying on your memory. How many similar sonnets and paragraphs might Shakespeare have?
Well, I would guess a lot.
Right? So this is where you're starting to get into that idea of overlapping thoughts, and you're not sure, and you might have heard a concept called hallucinations. Or there's this idea in AI where we humans know that it's lying to us. And then it might get to the point of even gaslighting us. Back in the day, 2 years ago, there's stories about this, and it was amazing. But the main reason is because if you're relying on a PhD to only reference their own brain and cite a very specific detail, it's quite difficult. But then on the librarian side, what would be your approach if I ask you to cite the 5th paragraph in Hamlet.
I would open the book and read it.
Easy, right? And like the odds of you getting that wrong, much lower, right? Okay, but you might missay a word, but you got the gist. And at the end of the day, you can give me the book. So this is the importance of how we leverage our AI. And it doesn't always mean just because you can have a PhD doesn't mean that that's the right solution. And going back to your question about what do we do at Deloitte and my kind of role in this, it's demystifying these elements, because I find that it's such a fast-moving space. And even to myself, it feels like if I'm not using it every day, that my world's going to change or I'm falling behind in the space. But that's not the case. It's a fancy, fantastic technology that has a place and time, but it's not everywhere.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, actually, and I appreciate that explanation. So where can the average person see AI in action in their everyday lives these days, or can we?
The best part is everywhere. The moment that you're probably waking up to the moment you're going to bed, you're interacting with some version of artificial intelligence. So your phone is the best example. Everything from social media to the ads that you're seeing on your phone, anything that you're interacting with online, there's kind of two components to that. The information is being tracked. You've probably heard of the cookies. Every single website takes those cookies. Well, what happens with the cookies? That information then goes into big tracking systems within the Googles of the world. And they say, well, based on Gordon's interests, and he's a CPA and he has a podcast, maybe he's interested in these type of advertisements. And all of that is powered by AI. And like I mentioned, like self-driving cars, the way that we get our weather, even video games, myself, huge nerd, the evolution and what's going to be happening in video games. We could have a whole separate podcast just on the last 3 weeks of new technology releases alone. So I think that it's almost one of those questions of when are we going to be, like, how many years are we away from us always interacting with AI? Whereas like it's harder to interact with a human on a day-to-day basis.
So are services like Siri and Alexa, that's all AI, I assume?
Exactly,
Okay.
yes. Yeah. And anything pretty much where you're not dealing with a human directly, at this point, you can probably assume that there's some version of either AI, automation, or something. Like if you can't see the person, I'm sure you've heard of the deep fakes, or you've seen videos where you can have phone calls with seemingly real people. That's part of that angst that we'll get back to. But that's the bottom truth is AI is here to stay, and it's in every facet of our life, and it's only increasing.
Wow, I had no idea. So what about in business? How is AI being used in business and more specifically in accounting? Or is it?
So I find that going back to the basics of what AI is prediction machine. So the big, and I'll add another term here. If you've been on LinkedIn, at least my LinkedIn's a little bit biased right now, but agents, that's the word. 2025 is the year of AI agents. So I think first and foremost, that's going to be the big thing that's coming out this year is these automations that are able to run a process from end to end that have maybe not completely defined rules. So I mentioned before we have this robotic process automation, and the way that works is it's very rules-based. If this is true, then this happens. If that is true, then that happens. But if this scenario has not been scripted, everything breaks. And that's the big difference with how AI is going to change that. We've been doing automations for 20-some years at this point, but now AI lets us add a level of managing uncertainty. And that level of uncertainty is, if you think about your day-to-day job or your task that you have, I would say in my world, there's probably 20-30% of them are very repetitive. You got to enter your time. You got to do this and you got to do that. But then you have this other gap of 20 or 30% where it's very similar, but there's nuances. You might need to produce a similar report, but for a different team. So you got to use a slightly different format. Or there's a new leader that you need to CC into an email. So all of these little nuances are things that AI is going to be able to take care of, either already is taken care of or is on the next step of disruption. So these prediction machines, anything where you need to predict when is my equipment going down if you're in oil and gas, or how can I determine my market segments for this new product? historically you can either figure it out yourself or you can use AI to look for patterns between the different demographics or the types of personalities that are buying your products. And then you can get all the way to optimizing your supply chain from end to end based on, again, all of this data input to what is the predicted outcome. And the big component here is as long as you have data, there's something of value that you can probably do with AI.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. I can see how that would serve business, having those kinds of functionalities with AI for sure. Stan, what do you think today's university and post-secondary students who are planning careers in business and accounting, what do they need to know about AI in order to prepare for their future careers? Do you think they need to have a firm understanding of AI, or is it just something they can learn if they want to?
I think the most important thing is to know that AI is here to stay, as I mentioned. The genie's out of the bottle. It's going to be around. And the best part of being a student at this point is I think that it's actually quite empowering. We did another recent discussion with a set of CPA educators in Alberta. And we were talking about, well, ChatGPT is such a disruptive force in a classroom. And it is. It's changing the whole game. But the calculator also did that. The calculator changed the way that we do math. But at no point is it good for someone not to know what addition is. Can't rely on the plus symbol on your phone or on your calculator. You need to understand the concepts behind it. Now, this is the interesting moment though. You need to understand the math of the calculator, but you don't need to know how the calculator itself works, like how you program that calculator. So there's this odd distinction of you need to know the power and what is the potential that you can achieve with this technology. Where is it heading? How is it changing things? But you don't need to know exactly how to build it. We don't know how cell phones work. They do. I just assume that someone's figured it out because we're able to exchange emails when we're not in the same room. But beyond that, I think it's the most important thing is understanding where are the opportunities and where is the space moving, and no one really knows. And that's the best part of being a student. You're in this great space of crazy innovation, disruption, and evolution. This technology is 2 years old. And it's changed so much already that university professors are losing their minds on how do I educate my class? But it's not an element of stop using ChatGPT. It's how do you use it to better yourself? It's the same with all technology is you can use ChatGPT to write a paper for you, or you can ask ChatGPT, how would you approach research for this paper? And that's the power. And the last thing I'll mention when it comes specifically to university students is I think the entrepreneur opportunities are going to be vastly bigger in the future because you don't need a whole team behind you to achieve something. If you have an idea, get AI to do all the other stuff.
Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. I really, I like the comparison between AI and the calculator. I'm old enough to remember when letting calculators in the classroom was a very sensitive and ferociously debated topic. So
Right?
I can see exactly where that makes sense. So should people today be worried about AI, taking away jobs and, being a job killer in the marketplace?
I think so. Again, there's this element of the calculator, but I'm going to add two more disruptions in the tech space. One, we're going to talk about Excel. That was a big game changer for bookkeepers. Historically, and I have this image, I'm not sure, Gordon, yourself, did you ever have to fill out paper versions of like trial balances or any of those sort of things?
Well, I'm not a CPA myself, but I have done, a lot of primitive work on paper. So
Right. And and you know what? I'm not going to lie. I'm going to date myself here. I have never had the luxury of doing paper-based review. I was stuck with Excel, unfortunately, where I didn't have to use whiteout and worry about where that I perfectly line up my numbers. I just got to do the next part, the analytics, the automation, extracting insights out of the value and out of the data that was captured, as opposed to doing that data capture. And this goes back to that one of the first questions of how I transitioned from the audit world into the AI world is, what do you want to be spending your time on? Do you want to be spending 80% of your time on gathering information or 80% of your time on critical thinking? So AI is going to give us more opportunities to do the critical thinking, but there's an important element to consider here. AI won't take jobs, but people using AI will likely outpace people not using AI. So that's the big crux here is if you're not following along, if you don't understand how to use this to your benefit, people are going to pass you. That's the big thing to consider about job loss is if you're comfortable, AI is going to make you real uncomfortable fast.
Yeah. I guess it was the same when computers were introduced into the workplace and, desktops. If you didn't want to learn how to use a computer, you probably weren't going to go very far. So.
Exactly. And my favorite one that people don't often think of, I don't remember where it came from, but the tractor.
The tractor?
Imagine how stressful it would have been to be a farmer and to hear like, hey, I know like you got 6 horses, like it's great, you can do all this work, but I got this thing. It works. I don't know why we call it horsepower, but like it can do the work of multiple horses. I don't need to feed it. There's no doctor. It works all the time. And I don't need half of the people. And then instantly it's like, okay, well, the world's going to break. What am I going to do, Gordon? I'm a farmer. And then, you fast forward a couple years and we're living in a concrete jungle and we're having a podcast.
Yeah.
Without a tractor, realistically, that's one of the things that got us to this place.
Wow, that's a great way of looking at it. So are there any downsides or risks to businesses using AI? Not the, angsty stuff, but just kind of like business risks associated with it?
I think there's an important element of there's a black box component to AI. Right now, we sometimes don't know why AI does what it does. It makes a bit of an awkward situation, right? That's hence that black box concept is we know we can put in some variables and then we know we can get an output. And sometimes we can replicate that as humans doing it, but we don't know exactly what was that one thing that led the AI to get to a certain decision. And we also got to remember that AI doesn't care. It's a math formula. We personify AI as this thing that like hangs out with us and it's in a room. It's a math formula. It doesn't care. It doesn't need to eat. It doesn't have a political agenda. But the programmers and the humans that produce the data are biased. And we're as faulted as we get. And that's the information that's being put into these superpowered systems. So that's the big concern for business is what is behind the curtain. That's an important thing to address. And it doesn't always mean that, whoa, hands off, we can't touch AI because we don't know. It's more so to say, where's the right place to use it, understanding that you might not always know. And you don't always need to know. Sometimes the decision's irrelevant, but if you're trying to give someone a mortgage based on a very personified example of their demographics, where they come from, all their history, that's pretty important. It sure would suck to know or to hear, hey, Gordon, you can't get a house. Why? Oof, the system said so.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to figure out, you say, I want an image of a cat and it's wearing a hat. And it doesn't look like Dr. Seuss, that's okay, right? There's no expectation there. So that's kind of the maybe a silly example, but the importance of understanding what's the potential risk of using AI in any certain situation.
Okay, well, I'm still in a little shock because it sounds like Alexa doesn't actually care about me. Is that what you said?
Unfortunately, Gordon. Sometimes, honestly, I heard Alexa, yours specifically does.
Oh,
Mine
okay,
doesn't.
good.
Yeah,
Good.
you're covered though.
Excellent. Well, that's good to hear. So let's move on to that angsty stuff then. So, what about the concern we often hear that AI poses a larger threat to people in society and is perhaps even an existential threat to humanity? Is that something we should be seriously worried about, do you think?
So existential threat, I'm not quite there, but I think the big thing is it's forcing us to reflect on ourselves. If we're going existential with it, and this is a great time, right? We're doing this early in the year. We just finished our 2 weeks of reflecting outside and looking at the beautiful skies and everything else. So a great moment of introspection. There are risks to AI. And I think the big one is thinking about the camp of the students where you can either use it to write your paper or you can use it to help you learn how to write papers. The same way with calculators. You either know how a calculator works or you just know what the symbols look like so you can answer the question. The scary part is how big is the camp? Because there's always going to be a camp. How big is the camp of people that use it to write the paper? That's the scary part for the next generation because AI is going to change things. Again, tractors, I don't know how many people could have predicted concrete jungles and podcasts from the moment that tractors were invented. But in some way, I'm sure in hindsight, we can draw some parallels. We're about to go through the tractor phase in a much faster world. The pace of how fast this technology is evolving is unmatched to anything, I mean, at least that I've seen. I'm not sure if there's any particular technology that comes to mind in your world, Gordon, that felt that it swept faster than this AI movement.
Well, there have been a few. Like, I mean, cell phones changed a lot of things for sure, but seemed fast at the time. But when you look back at it, you can now kind of was a reasonable pace. But so when you say it's going to change things the way tractors change things and cell phones change things, how do you think it'll change things? Or do we even know that?
This poses such a cool question because now it's taking the cell phone or the internet. Could we have predicted the true impact of the cell phone up until today? I think to some degree, maybe there's like David Bowie had some very interesting quotes about the potential of the internet, I think back in the 90s. And it was a very cool, different perspective about how it's going to connect everybody and change the way that we interact. But at the same time, I don't think folks would have predicted the amount of interconnectivity that we have around the world and that all 8 billion people can realistically talk to each other at any moment. So I know that AI is going to fundamentally change things and the world is going to look very different 50 years from now, especially because of this quickly evolving technology. But I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. The big predictions would be this agents or the concept of AI will be everywhere. All of your interactions will have some version of that. And you'll probably have your own parallel digital version of a Gordon that will walk in lockstep with you. It's not very far. It'll be a very personalized version. Instead of you having an Alexa, she will care because it'll be some version of you. And it'll know how you like your temperature and what your travel preferences are. And yeah, I think that's one personalized version of it. But from business, oof.
What about the fear that it'll go rogue, kind of like, in the movie 2001, the computer HAL goes rogue and develops an independent way of thinking. Is that something you think could happen with AI today? The HAL effect?
The HAL effect, the Terminator. Yeah, I think that's a bit far for now. There's a lot of steps that are still required. And there's this cool, I don't remember the term for it, but it's this concept that what we consider very easy is actually extremely hard for machines and vice versa. So it might be extremely wild math permutations and combinations, super hard for humans to mentally think through. Computers do this in moments. But being able to poke one specific spot on a wall based on the color, that's really hard for computers. And for us, we learn, like, that's a children 101. They love poking stuff. So I think that there's a lot of the limitation of AI or technology operating in the real world for now. And it's still happening. I'm sure you've either seen what Tesla's doing with their robots, but I think there's still a few years until mass adoption because they're very, very expensive. And all of the power, the computational power that's required for this technology is endless. And we're starting to run out of data. Funny enough, like we produce endless amounts of information every day, but now we're forced to produce synthetic information to train these models because we've used everything we have.
Wow. Okay, well, I think I feel a little better then, although maybe not 100% better, but thanks for that peek into the potential future. I know you often speak about 3 calls to action for people to follow when it comes to AI. Do you mind reviewing those calls to action for us?
Of course. And I find that they kind of evolve, but at the end of the day, the most important one is curiosity. I find staying curious and seeing how this technology evolves, trying it out, playing with it, is number one, because unless you've touched it, it's hard to explain what ChatGPT does. But once you've had a chance to use it for something, then okay, I can start to see the ideas and the potential and where else this could influence my life. And that's not just AI, right? Like that's just innovation and disruption. That's a natural thing that we have to experience in business and personal life. Now, the second piece is the balance. Just because you have AI doesn't mean that you have to use it every time. And that's going back to that idea of a PhD versus a librarian. Why overcomplicate a situation? Life is complicated enough. And then lastly has maybe of a boring thing it is, but there's a huge ethical component to this.
Yeah.
And there's so much opportunity to use this for bad acting or just making poor decisions. But there's so much beauty behind this technology too. And it can change the way that we interact and how we treat each other. Because yeah, sure, AI is a 10x version of human biases and problems, but it's also creating some amazing art. And you can see that it brings people together, it pulls people apart. But if you use AI to help people, it's going to be fundamentally just better for everybody.
Well, thanks for that, Stan. That's a great way to look at things for sure. I think that's a great place to wrap up, Stan. Thank you so much for this walk through AI and clearing things up on a lot of complicated questions for me. It's a big subject, lots of wrinkles, and you've made everything so clear and concise. We really appreciate it.
I'm glad that it's clear and concise to you. I'm still learning, but it's been an exciting time.
Oh, I'm an expert now. So if you need any help over at Deloitte, just give me a call.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks for coming in, Stan. It's been great to discuss this with you, and thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much, Gordon. It's been such a pleasure.
The Uncommon Sense podcast is presented by the CPA Education Foundation and funded by the Heshe CPA Knowledge Center. The Knowledge Center was created through a generous donation to the CPA Education Foundation by the late Brian Heshe. Brian was a distinguished Albertan, business leader, CPA, educator, and community builder. His generosity and commitment to education underpinned his good works across Alberta throughout his lifetime. The opinions expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the CPA Education Foundation. We would like to acknowledge that the CPA Education Foundation offices are situated on the traditional Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territories and Métis Nation homeland. The Foundation acknowledges that we reside on traditional and ancestral territories of many Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Their histories and culture influence our community to this day. The CPA Education Foundation is committed to helping build a province where Indigenous people and their voices and experiences are heard, valued, respected, and celebrated. Technical and recording services for this podcast provided by Wolf Willow Studios in Edmonton. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about us. If you have any comments on the podcast, write to us at cpaef@cpaalberta.ca. To learn more about the CPA Education Foundation and the Heshe CPA Knowledge Center, visit cpaalberta.ca/foundation. Thanks for listening.